There are moments in life when everything seems to collapse at once. Bills pile up, promises lose their meaning, and the home that once felt safe suddenly turns into a silent threat. Some stories feel like scenes from a movie, a daughter standing on the edge of losing everything while realizing too late that the warning signs were always there. This is one of those stories. For decades, a father repeated the same advice to his daughter. He said it calmly, he said it patiently, he said it without drama. And every time she dismissed it, not because she didn't respect him, but because the advice sounded too simple to matter. She thought real problems required complex solutions. She believed she had time. What she didn't know was that one forgotten sentence, a sentence she had heard her entire life, would become the only thing standing between her and financial collapse. This is the story of a woman who came dangerously close to losing control of her life until she finally understood the meaning of her father's words. Before we continue, if you appreciate stories that carry deep life lessons, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That simple action helps YouTube share this story with more people. Now, stay with us for the full story. Margaret was 55 years old and lived in a modest, aging house on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town in the United States. The house wasn't impressive by any standard, but it carried decades of memories. Holidays around a small wooden table, handwritten notes taped to the fridge, and quiet evenings that once felt secure. Over the years, however, that sense of safety had slowly eroded. Her father, Henry, was 85, a retired factory worker with weathered hands and a soft but steady voice. He had lived in the same town his entire life. Henry never earned much money, but he had something many people lacked: peace of mind. He paid his bills on time, avoided debt whenever possible, and lived simply. He wasn't wealthy, but he was never desperate. Margaret, on the other hand, lived a very different reality. She worked long hours in administrative jobs, bouncing between companies as departments downsized or restructured. Her income wasn't terrible, but it was unstable. Raises came and went, bonuses disappeared, and unexpected expenses always seemed to arrive at the worst possible moment. Like many people her age, Margaret relied heavily on credit cards to smooth out the gaps. At first, it felt manageable. A card for groceries, another for emergencies, a third for just in case. Over time, those just-in-case moments became routine. Margaret visited her father often, especially on Sundays. They would sit at the kitchen table drinking coffee, the same way they had for years. And almost every time, Henry repeated the same advice, calmly, without pressure. Don't spend what you haven't earned yet. Set something aside the moment your paycheck comes in. Protect yourself first. Margaret would smile, nod politely, and change the subject. In her mind, Henry's advice belonged to another era, a time when expenses were lower, life was slower, and people didn't have to juggle student loans, rising healthcare costs, and constant financial uncertainty. She believed her situation was more complex, more modern, more demanding. Besides, she told herself, she was responsible. She paid the minimums, she kept things moving. She assumed she'd get serious about savings once things stabilized, but things never stabilized. As the years passed, small cracks appeared. Credit card balances grew quietly. Interest charges became routine. Repairs around the house were postponed. The roof needed work. The heating system struggled each winter. Property taxes increased. Each issue was handled individually, never as part of a bigger picture. Margaret didn't feel reckless. She felt busy. She felt tired. She felt like she was constantly managing problems instead of preventing them. Henry noticed the tension in her voice, the way she avoided talking about money, the way she brushed off conversations about planning, but he never pushed.
He knew advice only works when someone is ready to hear it. What Margaret didn't realize was that she wasn't ignoring her father's advice out of stubbornness. She was underestimating it. She thought it was too simple to matter. And that misunderstanding was quietly pulling her toward a financial edge she didn't even know she was approaching.
For years, Margaret believed her problem wasn't money, it was timing. There was always a reasonable explanation for not saving: an unexpected bill, a temporary setback, a promise that things would be easier next month. Nothing felt dangerous on its own. The real danger was that this pattern never stopped repeating. She lived under a quiet but powerful assumption. Once this phase passes, I'll get everything under control. But the phases never truly passed. They only changed shape. First came the credit card used only for emergencies, then installment payments to get through tight months, then small personal loans meant to fix problems that were supposed to be temporary. Margaret didn't feel irresponsible. She felt busy solving things. That was the invisible mistake. She wasn't making one big bad decision. She was repeating small, unexamined decisions over and over again. Over time, her financial margin shrank. Every increase in income was absorbed by new obligations. Every moment of relief created another commitment. She worked harder, stayed longer hours, and felt like she was moving forward, yet somehow ending up in the same place. The warning sign arrived on an ordinary morning. Margaret logged into her bank account before leaving for work and froze. The balance was far lower than she expected. There hadn't been a major purchase, nothing had gone wrong, and yet there it was, barely enough to cover the week. Her chest tightened. Later that day, she received a call from her employer. The company was restructuring again. Her position wasn't eliminated, but her hours would be reduced. It wasn't a crisis, not yet, but it was a clear signal. Margaret hung up the phone with cold hands. For the first time, the future stopped feeling abstract. That night, she sat alone at the kitchen table with a stack of bills, statements, and receipts. She started adding numbers, subtracting obligations, and slowly realized something terrifying. She had no cushion, no backup, no real protection. She was living paycheck to paycheck without ever calling it that. As she stared at the paperwork, a familiar voice surfaced in her memory, her father's, steady and calm. Don't trust money you haven't earned yet. Save something the moment your paycheck comes in. Margaret closed her eyes. She had heard that sentence her entire life. She had ignored it because it felt outdated, because she believed it applied to simpler times, because she assumed real financial problems required complicated solutions. Now, sitting in silence, she understood something painful. The problem wasn't the economy, it wasn't bad luck, it wasn't even low income, it was the habit she never built. Margaret felt a deep wave of vulnerability, not just fear about money, but fear about how exposed she really was. She had worked for decades and still had nothing standing between her and disaster. There was no dramatic breakdown, no shouting, no tears, just a quiet realization. She hadn't lost control overnight. She had given it away slowly, every time she decided saving could wait. That moment, sitting alone with the truth in front of her, became her breaking point, not because money was gone, but because she finally understood what ignoring a simple rule had cost her.
Margaret sat at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet. The stack of papers in front of her hadn't moved, but something inside her had. The realization from earlier that day wouldn't let her rest. It kept replaying in her mind, tied to a single thought she could no longer ignore. Her father had been right. Not in a dramatic "I told you so" way, but in a steady, practical way that now felt almost unsettling in its simplicity. Henry never talked about money in big terms. He didn't use financial jargon. He didn't discuss markets, strategies, or trends. His advice had always been grounded in one unbreakable rule: pay yourself first before the world takes its share. To him, that rule wasn't optional, it was survival. Margaret remembered watching him as a child. Every Friday, after his paycheck cleared, Henry would sit at the same kitchen table with an envelope, a pen, and a small notebook. Before any bills were paid, before groceries were bought, before anything else happened, he would set aside a small amount of cash. Not a large amount, not a painful amount, just a consistent one. "That money is not available," he would say. "It doesn't exist for spending." Margaret had always assumed that kind of discipline belonged to a different era, a time when people didn't deal with modern expenses, subscriptions, and constant financial pressure. But sitting there now, she understood the truth he had been living by all along. The rule wasn't about how much you save. It was about when you save. Saving last meant saving never. The next morning, Margaret decided to test the rule, not perfectly, but honestly. When her paycheck hit her account, she transferred a small amount immediately into a separate savings account. No excuses, no calculations, no waiting to see what was left. It felt uncomfortable. Every part of her mind protested. What if I need that money later this week? What if something comes up? But she remembered another thing her father used to say. If you don't protect yourself first, everything else will take priority. Over the following days, Margaret noticed something unexpected. That small transfer, barely noticeable on its own, changed how she spent the rest of her money. She paused more often. She questioned purchases that used to feel automatic. She stopped assuming she could fix it later. The rule forced awareness. She added one more habit Henry practiced his entire life, writing everything down. Every expense, no matter how small, went into a notebook. Coffee, gas, groceries, online subscriptions she had forgotten existed. Within a week, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Money wasn't disappearing because of one big mistake. It was leaking through dozens of small, unchallenged habits. For the first time, Margaret could see her financial life clearly. The confusion that once felt overwhelming began to organize itself into something manageable. The advice she had ignored for decades wasn't outdated. It wasn't naive. It wasn't simplistic. It was precise. And more importantly, it worked. Henry had never tried to impress anyone with money. He had simply built protection, slowly and quietly, by honoring one rule without exception. Margaret finally understood what that rule really meant. Saving first isn't about money. It's about control. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was getting hers back. The first weeks were harder than Margaret expected. Following her father's rule felt unnatural at times, almost uncomfortable. Every instinct told her to keep money flexible, available just in case. But this time, she didn't negotiate with herself. The savings transfer happened the moment her paycheck arrived, every single time. What surprised her most wasn't the money she saved, it was the clarity she gained. By writing down every expense, Margaret began to see patterns she had never noticed before. Small purchases added up quickly. Convenience had a cost. Emotional spending showed up clearly on stressful days. None of it was shocking, but seeing it in black and white made it impossible to ignore. For the first time, money stopped feeling mysterious. After 10 days, her behavior started to change naturally. She didn't feel deprived, she felt intentional. She packed lunches instead of buying them. She paused before clicking Buy Now. She canceled subscriptions she had forgotten about and didn't miss them at all. The most powerful change wasn't financial, it was psychological. Margaret stopped reacting to money problems and started anticipating them. She created 3 simple categories inspired by her father's old envelopes: essentials, future protection, and personal flexibility. The system wasn't perfect, but it gave her direction. Each dollar now had a purpose before it was spent. By the end of the first month, something unexpected happened. Her savings account, once empty, held more money than she had managed to keep in years. Not because she earned more, but because she finally stopped leaking control. In the second month, Margaret did something she had avoided for a long time. She called her credit card companies. With clear numbers in front of her, she negotiated lower interest rates and structured a realistic repayment plan.
The conversations were uncomfortable, but empowering. She wasn't begging, she was informed. Around that same time, she visited her father. They sat at the same kitchen table, coffee steaming between them. Margaret didn't make a big speech. She simply told him she had finally followed his advice. Henry smiled gently. "I knew you would," he said. "You just needed to see it yourself." As weeks passed, the panic that once lived in Margaret's chest slowly loosened its grip. She slept better. She felt steadier. Unexpected expenses no longer felt like emergencies. They felt manageable. Her house, once a source of anxiety, began to feel safe again. Repairs were planned instead of postponed. Bills were paid with intention, not fear. The transformation wasn't dramatic, no sudden wealth, no overnight success, but something far more important had changed. Margaret was no longer waiting for stability, she was building it. The rule her father had lived by for decades had done exactly what it was meant to do, not make her rich, but make her secure. And for the first time in her adult life, Margaret understood that financial peace doesn't come from earning more money. It comes from respecting the money you already have.
Over the next few months, Margaret's life didn't change in a way that would impress strangers. She didn't buy anything flashy. She didn't suddenly level up her lifestyle. From the outside, her world looked mostly the same. But inside, everything was different. The fear that once followed her every time she checked her bank account began to fade. The tightness in her chest eased. She stopped waking up with the feeling that she was already behind. For the first time in years, she felt something she had forgotten existed: security. Every payday, the first transfer still happened automatically. That small amount moved into savings before she could touch it, before bills demanded it, before life tried to take it. At first, it had felt like a sacrifice. Now it felt like protection. Margaret realized something she wished she had understood earlier. She hadn't been struggling because she was lazy. She hadn't been failing because she didn't work hard enough. She had been vulnerable because she never built a buffer. For decades, she believed effort alone would keep her safe, but effort without structure leaves you exposed, and she had been exposed for a long time without even knowing it. One afternoon, she found an old handwritten note from her father tucked inside a book she had borrowed years ago. It was short, almost plain, but it stopped her in her tracks. "Money respects the person who respects it." Margaret stared at those words for a long time. She finally understood that respecting money doesn't mean obsessing over it. It doesn't mean living in fear or refusing to enjoy life. It means giving money boundaries. It means telling your paycheck what to do before it disappears. It means refusing to live on future income that doesn't exist yet. The world teaches people to focus on earning more, but Margaret learned that the real shift happens when you learn how to keep what you already earn. The lesson was simple, but it wasn't easy. And that's why so many people ignore it. Now, when friends complained about money, Margaret didn't give long speeches. She didn't recommend complicated systems. She said one sentence, the same one her father repeated for decades: "Save first, spend what's left." She knew not everyone would listen. She hadn't listened either. But she also knew that one habit, done consistently, could change a person's entire future. Because the difference between financial panic and financial peace often comes down to a small decision repeated over time. Margaret didn't become wealthy overnight. She didn't win at life in some dramatic way. What she gained was more valuable than instant success: control. And control changes everything. Because at the end of the day, money doesn't bring peace by itself. Peace comes from knowing you're not one emergency away from collapse. Margaret learned that too late to avoid the edge, but not too late to step back from it. And that's the truth behind her father's advice. It wasn't meant to make her rich. It was meant to keep her safe. And once she finally honored that rule, she stopped fearing the future and started building it.